The Pacific Ocean stretched out in endless shades of grey that August morning in 1944. A transport vessel pushed through rough, churning waters, its deck crowded with Japanese women and children. They had been evacuated from China, and now they faced an uncertain future as the ship carried them toward an American prison camp. Salt spray drenched their thin garments as they stood huddled together on deck. Many clutched small paper cranes, whispering prayers to themselves. The stories they had heard about Americans echoed in their minds, tales of torture chambers, prisoners left to starve, unspeakable cruelty. They had been taught that capture meant the end of everything. But when the camp gates finally swung open, something unexpected happened. Guards began distributing cafeteria trays laden with hamburgers. Glass bottles of ice-cold Coca-Cola appeared in their hands. There was soft white bread, creamy peanut butter, and portions that seemed impossibly generous. A woman named Aya stood frozen, staring down at her tray in complete astonishment. She couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. Then another guard approached, carrying a sewing kit. He offered it to her so she could repair her torn kimono. The women had braced themselves for brutality, for hunger that would hollow them out, perhaps even for death. Instead, the guards addressed them respectfully, using titles like Mrs. that made them feel almost human. How could their enemy possibly show such kindness? These Japanese women, now prisoners of war, found themselves in a reality that contradicted everything they believed about American camps and American cruelty. 3 weeks into her internment, Aya Tanaka knelt beside a patch of dark soil in the camp garden, her fingers moving carefully around tender shoots of lettuce pushing through the earth. The neat rows of vegetables stretched before her, each one a small miracle she still couldn't fully believe existed. Back in Tokyo, she had taught schoolchildren about American barbarism using textbooks filled with propaganda images designed to fill young minds with fear and hatred. Yet here she was, working alongside other Japanese women in a garden, while guards walked the perimeter with quiet professionalism. There was no swagger, no cruelty, nothing that matched the nightmares they had all imagined. When Sergeant O'Connor appeared at the gate, he called out a greeting that used her formal title, something that still caught her off guard each time she heard it. He approached with a careful politeness that seemed natural to him, carrying a wooden crate in his hands. "Thought you ladies might like some proper tools for the garden," he said, setting the crate down. Inside were small implements with gleaming metal surfaces that caught the sunlight. Kako Matsuda looked up from the weeding she had been doing nearby, her dark eyes narrowing with the suspicion she had carried since their arrival. "Why do you give us these things?" she asked in halting English, her voice sharp enough to make other women flinch. O'Connor simply nodded, as if her directness was completely reasonable. "A garden grows better when you give it the right tools, ma'am," he replied calmly. "My mother always said you can't expect much from a plant if you don't give it what it needs." Later, as the women worked with their new tools, talk drifted back to the previous evening's dinner. Midori Sito had saved half her portion of white bread for her 2 young sons, wrapping it carefully in a handkerchief even though they insisted they were already full. The sheer abundance of food still felt impossible, like something from a dream that might vanish if she stopped watching it closely. During those final desperate months in Shanghai before evacuation, a single slice of bread had been treasure worth fighting over. Things were different now. "The peanut butter is remarkable," whispered Fumiko, an older woman who had worked as a clerk in a government office before the war. "It's sweet and salty all at once. I have never tasted anything like it in my entire life." She found herself thinking of her daughter Mariko, left behind with her grandmother in Kyoto. In the letters she carefully composed, knowing camp officials would read them before they were mailed, she tried to describe the food without sounding disloyal. How could she possibly explain that their captors gave them meat every single day? That the children had access to real milk, the kind that hadn't been watered down or mixed with rice powder to stretch supplies. Even thinking such words felt treacherous. That afternoon, English lessons began in the camp's makeshift classroom. O'Connor had somehow procured actual chalkboards and boxes of white chalk that the women handled with reverent care. Aya stood before a small group, teaching phrases that might help them communicate with guards and staff. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was teaching the language of the enemy. Yet the women absorbed each lesson with quiet intensity. Please and thank you came easily enough. But when she taught them the phrase, "I am grateful," several women struggled with the very concept. How could they possibly be grateful to their captors? The idea seemed to turn everything they understood about the world upside down. Kako raised her hand, speaking rapidly in Japanese. Is it wrong to feel no hatred? When they treat us as if we matter, as if we are human beings? The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Around them, other women stopped their conversations, all waiting for an answer that none of them could provide. They had been conditioned to expect torture, starvation, humiliation. Instead, their bowls were filled with generous portions. The children received medical care when they fell ill, and guards stepped respectfully aside when they passed in the corridors. As evening approached and women prepared small notes of thanks to give to the guards, Aya found herself writing carefully in both Japanese and English. The words felt like a bridge spanning two worlds she had never imagined could coexist. On one side lay everything she had been taught about American cruelty. On the other stretched this bewildering reality of hamburgers served on real plates, Coca-Cola that fizzed cold against her lips, and men who called her Mrs., as if her dignity actually mattered. She folded the note with hands that no longer trembled quite so much as they had on that first terrifying day. Perhaps, she thought, the most dangerous thing about this place wasn't the guards or the fences. Perhaps it was hope itself, growing quietly in the fertile ground of unexpected mercy. The 4th of July arrived with heat that shimmered off the concrete pathways. But inside the mess hall, red, white, and blue bunting had transformed the utilitarian space into something almost festive. Aya stood with the other women near the serving line, watching camp staff arrange tables laden with food that seemed to belong in a dream rather than a prisoner facility. "Is this real?" whispered Fumiko, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of hamburger patties stacked on platters with golden sesame seed buns gleaming under the lights. Beside them sat bowls of potato salad, corn on the cob glistening with butter, and rows of Coca-Cola bottles sweating in metal tubs filled with ice. Kako translated quietly for those whose English remained limited, her voice carrying a note of wonder she tried to suppress. "They say it's their Independence Day, a celebration of their freedom." She paused, struggling with the concept. "They want us to join them." The invitation felt surreal. Midori held her sons closer to her sides, their small faces tilted upward in curiosity rather than fear. The younger boy, Hiroshi, had grown bold enough over recent weeks to smile at some of the guards, though he still pressed against his mother's leg when they approached too quickly. Sergeant O'Connor appeared beside their group, his usual quiet courtesy softened by something that might have been genuine warmth. "Ladies, please help yourselves. There's plenty for everyone." He gestured toward the laden tables with the same careful respect he showed during their daily interactions, as if they were honored guests at his family dinner table rather than enemy nationals under guard. The first bite of hamburger sent a shock through Aya's senses. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, nestled between bread so soft it seemed to dissolve on her tongue. She had eaten beef perhaps 3 times before the war, never anything remotely like this. Around her, other women took tentative bites, their expressions shifting from wariness to amazement. But it was the Coca-Cola that truly undid them. The first sip brought gasps of surprise at the sharp sweetness, the way the bubbles danced across their tongues. Kako actually laughed, a sound so unexpected that several guards turned to look with smiles rather than suspicion. "It tastes like happiness," she said in Japanese, then attempted the phrase in English for O'Connor's benefit. "Tastes like joy." He nodded, his weathered face creasing into a grin. "That's about right, Mom." As the afternoon wore on, inhibitions began to dissolve like sugar in warm tea. The camp's small band played folk songs, some of which the women recognized from radio broadcasts heard before the war. When the musicians began playing "She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain," Kako found herself humming along, then quietly translating the words into Japanese for the others. The moment that would stay with Aya forever came when young Hiroshi approached one of the guards, a freckled boy who couldn't have been much older than 20. With the fearless curiosity of childhood, Hiroshi pointed to the guard's uniform buttons and spoke rapidly in Japanese. The confused guard looked toward Kako for help. He asks if they're gold, she translated. The young soldier knelt down to Hiroshi's level, carefully unpinning one of the brass buttons from his sleeve. He pressed it gently into the boy's small palm, a gesture so tender that Midori's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Tell him it's not gold, but it's his to keep," the guard said. That evening, as the women returned to their barracks, they carried far more than full stomachs. They carried the impossible weight of joy they hadn't expected to feel again. Aya found herself humming one of the American folk songs, the melody weaving through her thoughts like a thread connecting two worlds she had believed were separated by an unbridgeable chasm. In her cramped quarters, she opened the small notebook that had become her lifeline and began to write. "My dearest Mariko," she started, "today I tasted America, and it was nothing like the bitter poison we were promised it would be." She paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. How could she explain to her daughter that their enemies had shown them more kindness in 2 months than they had received from their own government in the final year of war? Outside her window, the last strains of American folk music drifted across the camp, carrying with it a revolutionary idea. Perhaps mercy could bloom in the most unexpected places. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, delivered by a camp administrator whose face bore the weight of words too heavy for ordinary speech. Aya was teaching her English class when the man appeared in the doorway, his clipboard trembling slightly in his hands. The women fell silent, reading in his expression what their limited English could not yet comprehend. "Ladies," he began, then stopped, clearing his throat. "The war is over. Japan has surrendered." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Kako stood slowly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor. "Surrendered," she repeated in English, then switched to rapid Japanese, her voice carrying a question no one yet knew how to answer. The word came down like a death knell. Japan had fallen. But that wasn't what broke them. What shattered them completely was what came next. 2 entire cities had been wiped from the map, destroyed by weapons that defied comprehension. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. When the administrators spoke those names, they fell like heavy stones dropping into still water, each one sending tremors through the room. The assembled women felt those ripples in their bones. Some of them had family in those places, others knew people who might have been there, working in offices, shopping in markets, living their ordinary lives when the bombs fell. Fumiko simply collapsed. Her chair scraped backward as she sank into it, and her notebook tumbled to the floor, pages scattering like autumn leaves. Her sister worked in Hiroshima, at a textile factory near the center of the city. She watched herself do the calculations, distance from the factory, shift schedules, times when her sister might have been at her loom or stepping outside for air. The odds that anyone she loved could still be breathing. The camp transformed into something like a funeral hall in the days that followed. Women who had been learning to smile again retreated into themselves. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola bottles that once felt like treasures now seemed cruel. How could they have let themselves enjoy these things? How could they have laughed while their homeland turned to smoke and ash? The diary pages stayed blank. Ia couldn't make her pen move. Each time she tried to write, her thoughts scattered like cinders. Had she betrayed everyone back home by accepting American kindness? The question circled constantly, gnawing at her. Every gesture of mercy from the guards now felt contaminated, poisoned by the knowledge of what American weapons had accomplished. Hiroshi still kept the brass button a guard had given him, but now he hid it under his pillow like something shameful, something he needed to hide from his mother's pain. His mother watched him with eyes that had lost their light. How do you explain to your child that the same people who gave him ice cream also made 2 cities vanish? Arguments erupted on the 3rd day. Whispers cut through the mess hall like knife blades. Women blamed themselves for accepting comfort, for letting their anger soften. Others defended the guards, insisting that kindness and destruction could somehow exist side by side in the same nation, the same war, the same complicated human heart. Kako stopped singing the American folk songs. She sat by the fence, staring through the chain link at a future too uncertain to imagine. When O'Connor came near with his usual courtesy, she turned away. The understanding they'd built together with careful words and small moments seemed to crumble under the weight of nuclear fire. Thursday night found Ia alone with her diary, staring at an empty page. The same people who had shown her respect, who had given her chalk for teaching, possessed weapons that could erase entire cities. How could mercy and destruction spring from the same source? She picked up her pencil, then set it down. Outside she could hear Sergeant O'Connor making his rounds, his footsteps measured and deliberate as always. But those sounds carried a different meaning now. Kindness and catastrophe could wear the same uniform, speak the same language, salute the same flag. The notebook remained empty as darkness settled over the camp, and with it came the understanding that some truths were too complicated for simple words. The war was finished, but the work of understanding what it meant to find humanity in unexpected places was just beginning. Silence fell across the camp like fog, thick and suffocating. For 5 days, Ia ate nothing but rice and water. Her body was rejecting what felt like participation in some obscene celebration of destruction. The other women moved through their routines like spirits, their faces bearing the weight of unanswerable questions. It was Nurse Rebecca who finally reached through that silence. She appeared at Ia's bedside on a grey morning when the August heat had finally broken. The American nurse was perhaps 40, her greying hair pinned back strictly, her eyes carrying the recognition that comes from witnessing too much suffering. She held a simple brown notebook, its cover worn smooth by constant handling. "Mrs. Tanaka," she said quietly, settling into the chair beside Ia's cot. "I know you've been writing. Before all this happened." She gestured toward the window, encompassing the weight of surrendered nations and atomic bombs in one movement. "My grandmother kept a diary during the influenza pandemic. She said it was the only way she could make sense of living through something senseless." Aya turned away, but Rebecca continued, her voice steady with the authority of someone trained in healing. She wrote about neighbors who died and neighbors who brought soup, about doctors who saved lives and undertakers who raised their prices, about human beings being human beings, which means they're capable of everything all at once. The notebook sat between them like a bridge. Neither woman had crossed yet, but then Rebecca spoke again. "Your daughter needs to know her mother survived. She needs to know what that looked like, not just the history books, but the real moments, the truth of it." That afternoon, Ia held a new notebook, its blank pages both frightening and full of possibility. She didn't start with grand statements or political analysis. She started with Hiroshi's face the first time he tasted ice cream. The pure wonder in his eyes had been real, unspoiled by knowledge of what would come later. That moment had mattered, regardless of what followed. Slowly, the other women began to emerge. Kako started humming again, not the American songs this time, but traditional Japanese melodies that seemed to anchor her to something deeper than politics or nationality. When one of the younger guards asked about the meaning of a song, she translated with weary patience, having learned that understanding required effort from both sides. Midori let her sons play with the other children again, though she watched them fiercely. When Hiroshi showed his button to a new friend, she didn't take it away. Instead, she helped him polish it until it gleamed like a small sun in his palm. "Kindness received is still kindness," she told Ia one evening, even if the hands that gave it also did terrible things. Early September brought preparations for repatriation. Paperwork and medical examinations would send them back to a Japan they could barely imagine. As Ia packed her few belongings, she wrapped the notebook carefully in clean cloth. Its pages now held fragments of truth too precious to lose. The taste of hamburgers, the sound of children laughing, the sight of guards who chose restraint over cruelty, even when their nation chose devastation over surrender. On the final evening, Sergeant O'Connor appeared at the women's barracks carrying a small cardboard box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were Coca-Cola bottles, still cold from the ice house. "Thought you might want to remember," he said simply, distributing them with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout their time there. Ia accepted hers with hands that barely trembled. The bottle felt solid and real, a tangible reminder that complexity could coexist with compassion, that human beings contained multitudes too vast for simple judgment. She would carry it home to Mariko, along with the notebook and the impossible story it held. As the sun set over the camp for the final time, painting the sky amber and rose, Ia opened her diary to a fresh page. "Today I learned," she wrote, "that the heart large enough to hold love is also large enough to hold contradiction. And perhaps this is what it means to be fully human." The ship cut through Pacific waters, the color of old pewter. Aya stood at the rail with her bundle of possessions, the Coca-Cola bottle wrapped carefully beside her diary, both seeming to belong to a different lifetime despite being only days old. Around her, other women gathered in small groups, their voices tentative, learning to hope again. The Japan they were returning to existed only in fragments, cities flattened, families scattered, an entire nation bent beneath occupation and surrender. Kiko had heard her parents and Tokyo survived, but their neighborhood was gone, replaced by rubble and temporary shelters. Midori held her sons closer, knowing the grandmother who was supposed to care for them had died in the final bombing raids. Yet as their homeland appeared on the horizon, Aya felt something unexpected rising beneath the grief and uncertainty. Not joy exactly, but quiet determination born from months of discovering that survival could take forms she'd never imagined. The notebook contained more than memories of hamburgers and kind guards. It held proof that mercy could grow in the darkest places, that dignity could be restored even in captivity, that human beings possessed a capacity for grace that transcended the uniforms they wore or the flags they saluted. The disembarkation was chaos, managed by exhausted officials processing returning prisoners with mechanical efficiency. Aya found herself separated from the other women in the maze of paperwork and examinations. Her bundle was searched and catalogued by clerks who noted the Coca-Cola bottle with curiosity and suspicion. "What is this?" asked a young official, holding up the bottle as if it might contain something dangerous. "A memory," Ia replied simply, and something in her tone convinced him. He wrapped it carefully and placed it back without further questions. The train journey to Kyoto carried her through landscapes marked by war like old wounds beginning to heal. Rice fields had been replanted where bombing hadn't destroyed the soil. Children played in the ruins of buildings, their laughter a defiant assertion of life. At small stations, she glimpsed American soldiers directing reconstruction work alongside Japanese workers, their interactions marked by the same careful courtesy she'd witnessed in the camp. Mariko was waiting at Kyoto Station, taller than Ia remembered, wearing clothes mended many times over. But her eyes held the same bright intelligence that had always made Ia's heart swell. When they embraced, the months of separation collapsed into a moment of pure reunion. "Welcome home," Mariko whispered. That evening, in the small room they shared with Ia's mother-in-law, Ia unpacked her bundle while Mariko watched with fascination. The sewing kit that Sergeant O'Connor had provided drew admiring comments from the older woman. But it was the diary that captured Mariko's complete attention. "You wrote all of this in the camp?" Mariko asked, turning pages with reverent care. "Every day toward the end," Ia replied. "I wanted you to know what really happened, not the stories others might tell, but the truth. The whole truth." As Mariko read, her expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and finally wondering understanding. Here were hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Yes, but also guards who called her mother Mrs. when her own government had reduced her to a number. Here was the complexity of finding grace in captivity while cities burned, of accepting kindness from those whose nation had brought destruction. Years later, when Mariko had children of her own, she read them passages from their grandmother's diary. Not to forgive or forget the horrors of war, but to remember that even in humanity's darkest chapters, individual souls could choose mercy over hatred, dignity over revenge, hope over despair. The Coca-Cola bottle, long empty but carefully preserved, sat on their shelf as a testament, a reminder that enemies could become sources of unexpected grace, and that the heart capable of surviving war was also capable of embracing peace.